armor piercing damage, the unsung hero of the Total War universe. While I'm sure many people are aware of armor piercing and what it does, let's get a little bit deeper into it so we understand exactly what we're working with and how essential it is to victory. So if you've seen pretty much any video I've ever done before, you've probably heard me banging on about armor piercing. It's a very important part of the game and you need to know how to wield it efficiently to make the best use of your troops. So how does it all work? Well, the weapon damage stat that you can find on the unit card is a split between two separate stats, what we'll call base damage and armor piercing damage. These are of course represented in numbers, and every time your unit lands a hit on the enemy, they'll damage for both the base and armor piercing damage values. However, base damage has a chance to be reduced by the enemy's armor, as in it won't do as much damage because they've got a lot of armor on. How much of the base damage value is applied to the enemy will be determined by an invisible dice roll, thus leaving some of the damage that you do completely up to chance. And the more armor a unit has, the better their chances of blocking a lot of that base damage. And as for the armor piercing value, that is always applied to an enemy no matter what. No matter how much armor they've got, they are always going to take that amount of damage, whatever the value number says. The only way you can reduce that number is through ward save and physical resistances and things of that nature. So that is pretty much the gist of it. You can get a little bit more complicated with this in terms of how the base damage works and things, but for the most part it doesn't really matter. But I think it is important to understand that base damage isn't always going to be applied and armor piercing is. This is where your armor piercing and non-armor piercing units really come into their own on how you use them. Allow me to use some guinea pigs to demonstrate. Oh, these are rats, aren't they? Close enough, I suppose. Plague Monk Censer Bearers, a high armor piercing damage unit. If you scroll over their weapon damage, you'll be presented with this box, which tells you that they've got 13 weapon damage, what we're calling base damage, and 31 armor piercing damage. So what that means is that every time one of these little rat men lands a hit on an enemy unit, they're guaranteed to land 31 damage minimum. It doesn't matter if they're fighting Chaos Marauders who have only 15 armor, or Chaos Warriors who have 100 armor. Both will feel the full force of 31 damage minimum. This is how we know that Plague Monk Censer Bearers will do very well against either Marauders or the Warriors. As for their 13 base damage, that will attempt to land at the full 13 damage, but depending on how much armor the enemy unit has, it will be reduced by a percentage. Possibly. Like I said, it's a dice roll, and the more armor the enemy has, the better their chances of blocking your damage. They may do 4 damage, they may do 9 damage, or they may do the full 13 damage. And that'll of course be added on to the armor piercing damage, so you may do 32 damage, 40 damage, or the full 44. So what does this mean for units that are the other way around? Units with low armor piercing damage but high base damage, like the Storm Vermin with Sword and Shield. Well, you can probably figure out that only doing 9 guaranteed armor piercing damage isn't very much. So again, no matter whether they're fighting Marauders or Chaos Warriors, they're not doing that much damage for sure. With their higher base damage though, they do have a better chance of doing more damage, even potentially equal to the Plague Monk Censer Bearers, but only against lesser armoured units of say 40 armour or below. So this is why they'll perform wonderfully against a whole bunch of Chaos Marauders. They can take them down, maybe 3 or 4 units before they get tired, but if some Chaos Warriors come along, they're going to have a churny fight trying to get through their armour. And so are the Chaos Warriors. They don't have much armour piercing either, so Storm Vermin versus Chaos Warriors is going to be a relatively even fight. So hopefully you can understand why non-armor piercing or units that do low armor piercing damage aren't going to be great against those heavily armored enemy troops. Whether it's infantry, monsters, cavalry, whatever, armor piercing works the same across all the unit types, and the best hope of taking down anything with heavy armor is going to be to hit it with as much armor piercing damage as you can. Now the thing about it though is that a lot of factions don't have cheap armor piercing units. You've got to pour money into it. The Empire don't really have any armor piercing infantry apart from greatswords. Halberdiers do have some armor piercing damage, they have a fair amount of it actually, but it's not really meant for taking on other enemy infantry like Black Orcs or Haganeth Executioners. They want to be going after cavalry and monsters with heavy armor. It's of course your greatswords who want to take down those Haganeth boys and Black Orcs. And it's the same with the cavalry. None of their cavalry has armor piercing really until you get to demigryphs who are very expensive. Even the almighty Reiksguard only have 12 armor piercing damage, so you're not really making the best use of them if you charge them into Black Orcs most of the time. If you get them into Orc boys though with their low armor, the Reiksguard can dish out much more damage and make them much better value for money. If we take a look at the Vampire Count's infantry, same issue, no real cheap armor piercing units, the cheapest you've got is 850, So you can't be spamming out armor piercing units with the vampires, or you're going to have a very small army. Same with the cavalry. Not until your 1400 gold hex wraiths are you really getting an armor piercing cavalry. And it's the same with most factions. Armor piercing is usually expensive, whatever section of the army it comes in. Some armies though do have armor piercing units which are quite cheap. The greenskins have nasty skulkers, but overall they're not a fantastic unit. They don't have much armor, they don't have much leadership, but for the price, if you get them into an elite armor piercing infantry somehow, maybe with some support, they could do a good amount of armor piercing damage and make them cost effective. Same thing with the Chaos and their Chaos Marauders with great weapons. They're not a fantastic unit, they probably will rout quite quickly, but they've got a decent amount of armor piercing damage that will always be applied every time they hit something. Doesn't matter what the unit is. If we take a look at the Dark Elves, again, they don't have much armor piercing for cheap, but their missile section is well equipped with armor piercing and it's not too expensive, which most factions don't have the luxury of cheap armor piercing missile units. So making sure you bring enough armor piercing along is often part of your army composition plan, and it depends on the faction you're facing, of course. The dwarves have a hell of a lot more armor than Norska, for example. So the money you spend on armor piercing units against the dwarves is going to be a lot more than what you need to spend against Norska. And then you have the dilemma of how to use those expensive armor piercing units. Do you charge them in and try to get them to take out the elite enemy infantry, like these Haganeth executioners here, at the expense of their own health, as they're going to take a fair battering? Or you could take your elite infantry and have them take down a ton of inferior units. These swordmasters will have no trouble against bleak swords, as you can see, and they can probably take down 3 or 4 units of bleak swords by themselves before they take a significant amount of damage. So which one's the better call is going to depend on the army compositions and what is the biggest threat to you, of course. Do you opt to take out the single elite infantry of the enemy at the expense of yours, or do you try and take out multiple weaker units of the enemy to try and even the numbers? If the enemy has a large number of units, this may be the better call, but you'll have to find another way to deal with their elite infantry. Which choice is best is of course based on the variables of the match and your judgment. So be sure to understand the importance of your high armor piercing units, as they have the potential to dish out far more damage than your non-armor piercing ones. Putting them in bad matchups or having them in matchups which other units could be doing better is a good way to waste your expensive units. So there you go. I hope you've enjoyed this, I thank you for watching, I will see you in the future.